He thought he was only doing a favor for his neighbor, dropping off a donation box at the shelter on the way to his morning coffee. One errand, 20 minutes, done. But the moment he pushed through the glass door and the warm animal smell hit him, something at the back of his neck tightened the way it used to before a mission went sideways. He almost left anyway. He had gotten good at almost leaving. Then a small black dog bolted around the corner of the intake counter, slid sideways on the linoleum, and crashed directly into his boot. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from today. And if this story finds something true in you, please subscribe. There are more of them coming. Cold had settled over Kelowna, British Columbia, the particular cold of late October that doesn't announce itself so much as simply arrive, the way old grief does, without knocking. The Okanagan Valley still held patches of autumn color on the hillsides above the lake, rust and amber and the last stubborn gold, but the morning felt stripped of warmth in the way that made you notice. The sky was just gray, and the trees were just bare, and the drive into town was just a drive. Nolan Beckett was 51 years old. He had the build of a man who had once been trained to move through darkness without sound, and the face of someone who had mostly stopped, trying to look like everything was fine. Broad through the shoulders, heavy through the jaw, with close-cropped gray hair, and eyes that were a steady, unremarkable brown, until something disturbed the surface, at which point they went flat and careful, in a way most people found unsettling without knowing why. His hands were large and had done things he did not talk about. He kept them in the pockets of his canvas work jacket more often than not. He lived alone in a house at the edge of Lakeview Heights, not quite town, not quite wilderness. A 3-bedroom place that had once been too small for the life he'd imagined inside it, and now felt enormous for the life he actually lived. He had bought it 12 years ago with his wife Celeste, who had loved the view of the lake, and the way the orchard next door smelled in spring, and the fact that the closest neighbors were just close enough to wave at, but not close enough to drop by uninvited. Celeste had a talent for knowing exactly how much of the world a person needed. She had been gone for 4 years. Nolan still woke at the same time every morning, so 500, a habit so deep it had outlasted any practical reason for it. He made coffee in the same pot, in the same kitchen, at the same counter where Celeste had once stood on her toes to reach the good mugs on the top shelf. He had moved those mugs to the lower shelf after she died. He had never quite figured out why that particular detail was the one that undid him every time he noticed it. His neighbor, Patricia Foss, 67, retired schoolteacher, sharp as a finishing nail and approximately as subtle, had knocked on his door the previous week, with a box of donated blankets and towels for the Kelowna Animal Shelter. Patricia had a round face and silver-streaked hair cut practically short, and she had been feeding Nolan slow, patient kindness since he moved into the house. The way you feed a stray that you know will bite if you reach too fast. She couldn't drop the box herself, she'd explained, because her daughter was visiting from Calgary and they had plans, and she knew Nolan drove past the shelter on the way to the hardware store, and it would only take a moment, and the animals needed the blankets before the cold really settled in. Nolan had taken the box. That was how it started, not with drama, not with anything he would have chosen, just a box of old blankets and a woman who understood that sometimes people needed to be given a reason to leave their own driveway. The Kelowna Animal Shelter sat on a side street off Springfield Road, a low beige building with a mural of paw prints along the front wall, faded by 2 summers of Okanagan sun. Nolan carried the box inside, set it on the counter, exchanged 7 words with the young volunteer at the desk, and was turning to leave when the small black dog came around the corner. It was a mixed breed, somewhere between 8 and 10 weeks old, with a round head, stumpy legs, ears that hadn't decided what shape they wanted to be yet, and a tail wagging so hard its entire hindquarters moved independently of its front half. It had the cheerful, graceless energy of a creature that had never once considered the possibility of rejection. It ran into Nolan's boot, bounced back, looked up at him with bright copper-colored eyes, and then immediately began gnawing on his lace with the focused determination of a puppy who had discovered a sacred calling. Nolan looked down at it. "That's Pepper," said the volunteer. A young woman named Justine, 20-something, with purple-streaked hair, and the efficient warmth of someone who had learned to care about animals without breaking herself open every single day. She does that to everyone. Nolan crouched and detached the lace from the puppy's teeth without enthusiasm. Pepper took this as an invitation, planted both front paws on his knee, and attempted to climb him. "There's another one," Justine said, in a tone that was not quite casual, from the same litter. Nolan didn't ask. He didn't need to ask. Some part of him already knew, from the quality of Justine's voice, from the small meaningful pause before she said it, that the other one was the reason she had mentioned it at all. At the far end of the intake hallway, between the wall and the leg of a metal shelving unit, a second puppy sat absolutely still. It was the same age, roughly, but smaller through the body. Dark brindle, brown and black layered like old bark, with white markings on its chin and one front paw. Its ears were upright and working constantly, rotating toward every sound, and its eyes, pale gold, winter-light eyes, were fixed on Nolan with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like assessment. Measuring the room, measuring him, weighing probabilities the way you did when experience had taught you that the world was something to be read before it was trusted. Nolan's chest went quiet in the wrong way. He knew that look. He had worn it himself in every airport, every grocery store, every ordinary civilian space where nothing was a threat and yet every exit needed to be accounted for. The look of a creature that had learned early that stillness was safer than hope. "Flint," Justine said softly, from behind him. "We think something happened to them before they were brought in." Pepper recovered fast. Flint hasn't really. She startles at sudden movement. Barely eats unless Pepper's already eating. They were found together in a storm drain off Benvoulin Road after the first rain. Pepper was on top of her. Nolan straightened. Pepper was now hanging from his jacket zipper with the conviction of a mountaineer. "The shelter's overcapacity," Justine said. She was trying to be matter-of-fact about it. She was not quite succeeding. "If we can't place them together by the end of the week, we'll have to separate them. Pepper has a family interested. Flint doesn't." The hallway felt like it contracted. Pepper made a sound that was somewhere between a bark and a hiccup, delighted with her own existence. Flint did not move. She only watched Nolan with those pale gold eyes, patient and still and very, very alone in the way that had nothing to do with the number of animals around her. Nolan said, "I'm not looking for a dog." No one contradicted him. That was the thing that stayed with him after he left, that no one had pushed back, no one had told him he was wrong. And somehow the absence of argument had felt worse than the argument would have. He drove to the hardware store. He bought sandpaper and deck screws and a length of weather stripping for the back door that had been letting cold in since September. He stood in the parking lot for 4 minutes, with his keys in his hand, and then drove home without the weather stripping because he had left it on the counter by accident. He didn't go back for it. He sat at his kitchen table with the same coffee going cold, and the same view of the lake going gray under the same October clouds, and the same silence his house had been generating for 4 years. And he thought about Flint, not about Pepper, specifically, though Pepper was objectively ridiculous and impossible to ignore, but about Flint, pressed against the wall of the intake hallway, watching him with eyes that had learned not to expect anything good from a stranger's arrival. He thought about a dog he hadn't let himself think about directly in years. His name had been Kodiak. A Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, black-masked and sable-coated, lean and electric with intelligence that sometimes seemed to come from somewhere beyond animal instinct. Kodiak had been Nolan's partner on 3 deployments, the last of which ended in a compound in a country Nolan still did not name out loud. Kodiak had found the device. The men had come home. Kodiak had not. Nolan had written the report. He had folded the citation into a box. He had not cried, because he had been trained not to, and because crying felt like something that would open a door he could not close again. He had closed the door instead. Celeste had known, in the way she knew most things about him that he didn't say. She had sat beside him the night he came home, and not asked questions, and not offered comfort that would have felt like a lid over the wound, just sat there in the particular steady way she had, as if staying was its own form of language. He had loved her for that more than he could ever organize into words. When she died, the door he had never opened was still closed, and now there was no one to sit beside him while he decided whether to try. He was still thinking about it when his phone lit up on the table. It was Justine from the shelter. He didn't know how she'd gotten his number, and then remembered he'd written it on the donation form without thinking. The first message was a photo. Pepper had climbed into an empty food bowl and was sitting inside it with an expression of complete intellectual satisfaction, nose dusted with kibble, one ear folded backward, looking like a cartoon of something rather than an actual dog. The caption read, "She believes this counts as a territory claim." The sound that came out of Nolan surprised him. Not quite a laugh, not one. He put the phone face down on the table and stared at the window and the gray lake beyond it. The second message came 3 minutes later. The photo was Flint, curled in the far corner of a kennel run, dark body pulled tight, chin resting between her front paws, pale gold eyes open and fixed somewhere past the camera's frame. She was not sleeping. She was enduring. She ate 4 pieces of kibble tonight, Justine had written, only after Pepper had already started. If they separate her, I'm worried she'll stop eating completely. Nolan read it twice. He set the phone down and went to stand at the back window, the one that faced the orchard next door, which was bare now, just silver-gray branches in rows under a colorless sky. The kind of view that didn't ask anything of you. He stood there for a long time. He had a friend named George, not a close friend. That was not how Nolan kept people, but a man he had known since his 3rd year in the service, now retired like him and living in West Kelowna. George called him every 2 weeks with the reliability of utility bill, never asked about feelings, talked mostly about fishing and the Canucks and the price of gas, and had a way of communicating concern through the very deliberate absence of it, like a man leaving a light on in a window and pretending not to notice who it was for. Nolan called him. George picked up on the second ring, said, "You sound like weather," and waited. Nolan told him about the shelter, about Pepper and Flint, about the photo of the food bowl and the photo of the dog who had stopped eating. When he finished, there was a pause on the line that George used the way other men used words. "You calling to talk yourself out of it or into it?" George said. Nolan didn't answer. "Right," George said. "Same thing." He hung up. That was the whole conversation. Nolan stood in his kitchen for another few minutes, looking at the lower shelf where Celeste's good mugs were, and then he found he was putting on his coat without having consciously decided to. The shelter opened at 8. He was there at 7:53. Justine looked up when he came through the door and had the good sense not to smile in the way that would have made him feel managed. She just said, "They're in the morning run," and pointed him down the hall. Pepper heard him before she saw him. She appeared at the end of the hallway in a controlled explosion of small black body, all velocity and no trajectory, skidded again on the same patch of linoleum as if she had not taken any notes from their first meeting, and collided with his boot with the enthusiasm of a creature for whom gravity was just an opinion. Flint stood in the hallway doorway. She did not run. She looked at him with those pale gold eyes, and one ear moved forward, and then very slowly, as if each centimeter costed something, she took 1 step toward him. Nolan crouched down. He kept his hands loose where she could see them and did not reach out. Flint stopped 2 feet away and trembled faintly, the way cold air trembles over hot pavement, and then she looked at Pepper, who was attempting to eat his bootlace with ceremonial gravity, and then she looked back at Nolan. Something passed between them that Nolan did not have a name for and did not try to name. He signed the papers at the front desk with the grim focus of a man completing a mission briefing in a language he wasn't fluent in. Justine went through the food instructions, the vaccination records, the agreement to keep the sisters together, and slid 2 small collars across the counter. Pepper's was orange. Flint's was gray. Nolan picked them both up, looked at the 2 small dogs, and exhaled through his nose in the manner of a man surrendering something he hadn't known he was still holding. "Together," he said. "Nobody's separating them today." Pepper sneezed agreeably. Flint watched his face, and the tip of her tail, only the very tip, moved once. The house on Lakeview Heights had not had animals in it before, and it reacted to Pepper the way a museum might react to a 6-year-old on a birthday, with an immediate and comprehensive reorganization of what the concept of order meant. Pepper explored the kitchen in under 4 minutes, discovered the recycling bin, extracted a plastic yogurt container, and spent the next 10 minutes engaged in what appeared to be a territorial dispute with it. growling with concentrated ferocity, winning, and then looking around for someone to validate the victory. Nolan stood in the doorway and watched this. Flint moved differently. She came in slowly, following close to the baseboard, nose working steadily along the edge of everything, reading the room in careful layers. She sniffed the leg of the kitchen table, the corner of the rug, the cold draft from the back door that Nolan still hadn't fixed. She found the spot beneath the window where the afternoon light would fall, and she stood there for a moment, considering it, and then she continued her circuit. Eventually she chose a position beside the bookcase in the living room. She could see the front door, the hallway, and Nolan from there. She lay down with her chin on her paws and did not take her eyes off him. Nolan knew that positioning. He had chosen it himself in restaurants and waiting rooms and every house he'd ever been a guest in. Back protected, sightlines clear, exits accounted for. He sat down on the floor with his back against the couch because the veterinary paperwork had suggested letting her set the pace, and because his knees would regret this later. But there were certain things worth the cost. Pepper took his sitting down as an announcement that a new chapter of civilization had begun and immediately climbed onto his boot with a yogurt container still in her mouth. Flint watched. Nolan didn't push. He looked at the window. He let the time pass. After 11 minutes, Flint rose, crossed 4 feet of floor, and lay down again. Not at his side, not quite, not yet, but closer. He didn't make a sound. He had learned, in an entirely different context, that stillness was sometimes the loudest thing a person could offer. Patricia came by that evening with a covered dish, and the news that she had heard he had collected 2 dogs instead of dropping off blankets, and that this was either a miracle or a disaster, or more likely both. She set the dish on the counter, looked at Pepper, who was attempting to excavate the bottom corner of the couch, and then looked at Flint, who had retreated slightly at the sound of the knock, but was already watching Patricia with cautious interest. "Oh, this one's a thinker," Patricia said softly. "She is," Nolan said. Patricia looked at him with the directness of a woman who had been watching him from a careful distance for 4 years and knew better than to say too much at once. "You doing all right?" "I don't know yet." "Good answer," she said. Honest ones usually are. She didn't stay long. She knew how long to stay. That night, Nolan lit the fireplace more because the puppies were cold than because he needed it. Pepper fought sleep for 45 minutes with the conviction of a general refusing defeat, then collapsed in a heap beside the coffee table with her chin on the yogurt container and her legs pointing in 3 different directions. Flint stayed awake longer. She moved, eventually, from her spot by the bookcase. She came to rest not beside Nolan but near him. 3 feet away on the rug, body curved slightly toward the fire, pale gold eyes still open, still watching the room, but no longer watching Nolan the way you watched a threat. She was watching him the way you watched something you weren't sure yet how to protect. He understood that, too. He sat on the floor with the fire going low, and the wind coming off the lake, and the small particular sound of a puppy, snoring with reckless abandon on the other side of the room. And for the first time in longer than he could account for, the silence inside the house had a different quality, not emptiness. Something else. Something that was just barely beginning to have a shape. He had not allowed himself to feel it fully yet. He was still learning to distinguish what was grief, and what was fear, and what was only habit. But it was there. The way ice sounds different when it's starting to go in spring. He didn't name it. Not yet. 3 weeks passed, and the house on Lakeview Heights underwent a slow and decisive occupation. Pepper grew in all directions simultaneously. At nearly 10 weeks, she was broader through the chest, louder in her opinions, and had developed a sophisticated system for stealing socks from the laundry basket. She would present each sock to Nolan with the satisfaction of an anthropologist who had discovered a new artifact, and then defend it from all comers, including Flint, who ignored the socks entirely and watched this ritual with the patient expression of someone who had accepted that genius took unusual forms. Flint grew differently, quieter outward. Her brindle coat darkened along her back. She moved through the house less cautiously now, less close to the walls, though she still preferred the positions where she could see the most. She still startled at sudden sounds, still flinched when Nolan moved too quickly in her peripheral vision. but she had begun, in small and deliberate ways, to reduce the distance between them. It happened in increments so small you could miss them if you were looking too hard. One morning Nolan was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee when he became aware of warmth against his right leg. Flint had not made a sound. She had simply moved, at some point while he was looking at the window, and lain down with her shoulder barely touching his boot. He did not move. He drank his coffee and watched the lake and let her decide what the contact meant. She stayed for 22 minutes. Then she rose, stretched in the careful way of a dog who understood her own body, and returned to her spot by the bookcase as though nothing particular had occurred. Nolan set his mug down and looked at the space where she'd been for a moment, the way you looked at evidence. It was Patricia who eventually said the thing he had been waiting for someone to say. She appeared on a Tuesday evening with a bag of groceries he hadn't asked for, and the kind of errand that was clearly something else. She put away the groceries with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 3 children and would not be told where things went. And then she sat down at the kitchen table and asked him if he'd ever thought about going to the Kelowna Veterans Drop-In on Gordon Drive. Nolan said he hadn't. Patricia said that was what she thought, and that they were doing something in 2 weeks that involved shelter animals and veterans, and she thought the dogs might enjoy it, particularly Pepper, who would enjoy anything that involved an audience. Nolan said that sounded like something he wasn't going to do. Patricia said, "I know," and left the brochure on the counter where he would have to move it to make coffee. He read it that night, standing up, with his arms crossed, as if the posture would make him more resistant to the information. It was a community morning, the brochure said, hosted jointly by the drop-in and the animal shelter. Local rescue animals, some available for adoption, some just visiting. Coffee and donuts. Open to current and former Canadian Forces members and their families. An informal thing, nothing required. Flint came and sat beside him while he was reading it. She didn't ask him anything. She just leaned her narrow shoulder against his leg and looked at the floor. The truth was, there was a door in Nolan's house he had not opened in over a year. It was the second door off the hall, the one that had been Celeste's studio, where she painted on Sunday mornings in old jeans and one of his shirts, the radio on, paint on her hands, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine settling into the whole end of the house. After she died, he had put a few things in boxes and moved them in there and closed the door with the kind of finality that you tell yourself is practical and temporary, and that both of you know is neither. He had not opened it because he was not ready, and because the day he had tried, 6 months after the funeral, he had stood in front of the knob for 4 minutes, and then gone and made coffee instead. The night before the veterans' morning, he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark and listened to Pepper snoring from her bed in the corner, and to Flint's quieter breathing from the rug beside the bed, where she had begun sleeping 2 weeks ago without ceremony or announcement. Just one night she was in her usual spot by the bookcase, and the next she was here, in the dark, keeping watch. He got up at 0230 and went down the hall. He stood in front of the studio door with his hand on the knob. Flint appeared beside him. She had not made a sound. She simply was there the way she always was, pale gold eyes steady, one ear forward. He opened the door. The room smelled of dust and paint and closed-up time, and very faintly, almost not at all anymore, of the particular combination of her soap and her hair that he would never be able to fully describe to anyone. Celeste's easel was still standing. There were 3 canvases stacked against the far wall, turned away from him, the last thing she had been working on before the diagnosis. He hadn't looked at them. He hadn't been able to look at them. He sat down on the floor. Flint came and lay beside him. Not pressed against him, not yet, but close, her chin on her front paws. Present. From down the hall, Pepper snored on, oblivious and vital and comically irreverent, and somehow that was the thing that broke what needed breaking. The sound of her was so relentlessly alive in a way that made no concessions to the weight of anything. Nolan's shoulders dropped. The breath that came out of him was rough and too long and involuntary, and then the next one was worse, and by the third he had stopped trying to control any of it. He wept quietly, the way men did who had spent years learning not to, with his head down and his hands on his knees and something inside him finally letting go of the doorframe it had been gripping for 4 years. Flint pressed her side against his leg and stayed. Outside, the lake moved in the dark. Inside, Nolan sat until the worst of it passed, and then a little longer, with his hand resting on Flint's narrow back and the smell of his wife's studio around him, and the old grief finally doing what grief is supposed to eventually do. Not disappear, but breathe. The next morning, he drove them both to the veterans' drop-in. Pepper rode in the back seat with the alert eagerness of a traveler who had been promised something excellent without being told what it was. She pressed her nose to the window glass, fogged it, retreated, pressed it again, apparently delighted by the same view each time. Flint sat upright and still, watching the road, not frightened. Present. The Gordon Drive drop-in was a converted community room in a low brick building. Warm inside and smelling of industrial coffee and donuts, and the comfortable wool coat smell of older men and women who had stopped needing to prove anything. Folding tables held coffee urns and a few shelter brochures and a sign on a card table that said Animals, with an arrow drawn on it in blue marker. Pepper became a significant figure in the room within minutes. She ate half a donut that a veteran named Frank held too low, wagged through the entire apology, and then sat on his boot with the air of a politician consolidating an alliance. Laughter moved through the room warm and unguarded. Flint stayed close to Nolan. She moved through the small crowd carefully, her eyes reading each face, her body language measured. A few people reached down and she allowed it, leaning slightly away but not retreating, doing the math on each new human with the patience of someone who had learned that most of them would pass the test if given enough time. Then she stopped. Near the window at the far side of the room sat an old man who was not talking to anyone. He was perhaps 80. Possibly older, white-haired and very thin, with the posture of a man who had been strong once and knew the difference. His hands rested on his knees with the unsteady quiet of age, and his eyes were somewhere else entirely, looking at something the room couldn't provide. Nolan didn't know his name. He would learn later it was Henry Prescott, a Korean War-era veteran, widower, who came to the drop-in almost every week and spoke very little and left before the coffee ran out. Flint moved toward him. Without a command, without a cue from Nolan, without anything but whatever she had calculated in the time she'd been reading the room. She crossed the floor slowly and lay down beside Henry's chair, not touching him, not demanding, not performing. Just present, just there. The old man looked down at her. His hands trembled. He lowered one of them to Flint's head, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had not touched something living in longer than they would want to admit. "I had a dog like this," he said. His voice was cracked and small. Different color, same eyes. Flint did not move. She let him remember. The room did not go silent all at once. It quieted the way light changes. People drifted back, leaving a kind of space around the two of them, recognizing something too exact to intrude on. Nolan stood across the room with a paper coffee cup in his hand and Pepper sitting on his boot. He understood it then, with the force of something being said out loud for the first time. He had thought, when he took the dogs home from the shelter, that he was making a practical decision. Taking in two animals who needed a place, giving them that place. A clean transaction with a clear benefit and no expectation of anything in return. He had told himself this the way men who have stopped trusting their own feelings tell themselves things, firmly, plainly, without looking at it too long. But Flint had walked across the room to an old man sitting alone by a window, and she had not been asked to, and she had known, by some intelligence that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with what she was, exactly what he needed and exactly how to offer it. Nolan thought of Kodiak finding the device in the dark, not because he had been told to, but because he was built for the thing that mattered. He thought of Celeste, who had always moved toward the difficult feeling without apologizing for it. He looked at Patricia, who was standing near the donation table, watching him with the steady, patient expression of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for a long time and was too wise to celebrate it prematurely. He looked at Pepper, who had by now charmed 3 different veterans and was accepting a piece of someone's muffin with the regal composure of a dignitary receiving tribute. He looked at Flint, still lying beside Henry, whose hand had not moved from her head, whose eyes had come back from wherever they had been, and he felt, without warning and without permission, something that he had not felt in 4 years. Not happiness, not yet, nothing as simple or complete as that. More like the moment when the pressure in your ears equalizes after you've been underwater too long. A restoration of something basic, the sense that the surface was up there and reachable, and that your body still knew how to swim. Spring came back to the Okanagan the way it always did, without asking anyone's permission. The lake opened up under warmer light. The orchard next door went from silver sticks to green blur to white blossom in the space of 3 weeks. And the smell of it drifted through the kitchen every morning, when Nolan let the dogs out and stood in the doorway with his coffee, watching them. Pepper's relationship with the yard was an ongoing creative project. She had dug 2 investigation holes near the fence, staged a sustained campaign against a crow that visited the apple tree, and developed a complex theological position on squirrels that expressed itself through noise. She was 6 months old now, longer through the body, broader through the face, still with those copper eyes, and the cheerful, unshakable confidence of an animal who had never once been given a reason to believe the world was anything but full of opportunity. Flint had changed in a way that was harder to photograph but impossible to miss. She still moved carefully through unfamiliar spaces. She still read every room before she entered it, but the fear that had once shaped every movement, that constant braced readiness for the worst, had slowly loosened its hold, the way a fist opens when the thing it was protecting against is no longer present. She slept now without one eye open. She had developed the habit in the mornings of waiting by the back door until Nolan came downstairs, and then pressing her head briefly against his leg before going out, just a second, a small deliberate contact, before she moved into the yard. He never made a fuss of it. He understood that it was something she needed to offer on her own terms. He had opened Celeste's studio most mornings now. Not always for long. Sometimes just to let the light in. He had turned the canvases around. Finally, in March, on a morning when the snow was still on the ridge, but the sun was actual and warm through the studio window. They were landscapes, the lake and the hills mostly, painted in the particular way she had of finding color in things you expected to be gray. He had sat with them for a long time. He had cried, less violently than that first night in the studio, more like rain than like a storm. Flint had been there. The spare room door stayed open now. Patricia came by on a Thursday in April with cuttings from her garden and the information that Henry Prescott had asked about Flint at the drop-in last week, and wanted to know if Nolan ever brought her to the Thursday mornings. Nolan said he hadn't been going Thursdays. Patricia said that was what she'd thought, and looked at the garden cuttings and said nothing else. He went the following Thursday. George came by the week after that, unannounced, which was unlike him, and stood in the kitchen with a coffee and looked at the 2 dogs and the shoes by the door and the photographs Nolan had framed and hung in the hall. 2 of them, Celeste in the orchard and Kodiak in the field, side by side, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "House looks different." "It is different," Nolan said. George nodded. That was all. He drank his coffee and talked about the Canucks and left after an hour, and Nolan understood that this was George's version of everything anyone needed to say. One afternoon in May, Nolan sat on the back steps with the sun on his face and the orchard smell in the air, and Pepper running circuits around the yard with a tennis ball, and Flint lying across his feet, heavy and warm and completely still. The kind of still that wasn't tension, the kind that was trust. He thought about the day he had walked into the shelter with a box of old blankets and nothing particular to look forward to, and no particular reason to linger. He thought about Pepper crashing into his boot, and Flint pressing herself against the shelter wall, with those pale gold eyes, asking something she had no language to ask. He thought about the drive home with 2 puppies in the back seat and the way the house had looked when he opened the door, so orderly and so empty, so prepared for nothing. He looked at it now, the shoes by the door, Pepper's excavation hole near the fence, Flint's gray collar hanging on its own hook, the studio window open, the photographs in the hall. "I thought I was doing you both a favor," he said aloud, which was something he was still adjusting to, the talking aloud. Flint's ear moved. He had believed, when he walked out of the shelter with those signed papers in his hand, that he was the one extending something. Making a choice. Giving something that he had to give. It had taken him a while to understand the direction of it. He had walked into a shelter looking for nothing, and two small animals, one of them absurd and one of them broken, and both of them looking for exactly the same thing he had stopped believing he deserved, had found him instead. He had not rescued Pepper and Flint. Not exactly. Not only. They had done what the brave and the frightened sometimes do when they find each other in the right moment. They had made their way home together, each one carrying something the other needed, each one arriving somewhere they could finally rest. Flint sighed against his feet. Below the yard, the lake moved slow and silver under the May light. Above the ridge, the sky was the particular soft blue of a day that asks nothing of you and offers everything. Nolan closed his eyes and felt the sun and stayed.